Rain varnished the cobblestones of Grosvenor Square until they shone like polished obsidian, and the Whitmore townhouse glittered above them in defiance of the weather. Within its tall windows, chandeliers blazed and violins stitched bright ribbons of sound through the air, summoning London's most watchful eyes to witness Mrs. Agnes Whitmore's triumph. Silk rustled like secrets along the marble corridor, perfume mingled with beeswax and ambition. It was said that no hostess possessed a more disciplined smile, nor a sharper instinct for advantage. Tonight she would display her daughters, her own that is, like carefully curated jewels. Of the third girl, the one who had once borne the house's proudest name, not a whisper was permitted to rise. Above the ballroom, beyond the reach of candlelight and civility, Miss Eliza Whitmore sat upon a narrow trunk in the attic, her back straight despite the slanted ceiling that pressed down like an accusation. Dust lay soft as fallen snow upon abandoned frames. Rain tapped the eaves with patient insistence. She could hear the orchestra beneath her feet, a muffled heartbeat of society that refused to acknowledge her own. Each note seemed to say what her stepmother had declared in colder words, that Eliza's presence would only embarrass the house. A faint tremor moved through her fingers, not from fear alone but from a pride that had not yet consented to die. Eliza had inherited her father's quiet intellect and his inconvenient tenderness. When he lived, she had read aloud beside the hearth while he corrected estate ledgers, and he would look at her as though the world had arranged itself wisely. His death rearranged it otherwise. Mrs. Whitmore entered the household draped in widow's black that never seemed to lift from her spirit, though her gowns grew brighter with every season. With methodical grace she pruned the house of its softer elements. The old gardener dismissed, the faithful governess pensioned off, the portraits of Eliza's mother moved to dimmer corridors. At last she pruned Eliza herself, trimming her from public view with a justification delivered in a tone of benevolence. "Society can be unkind to fragile temperaments," she would murmur. "It is my duty to protect you from it." Protection, Eliza had learned, could resemble imprisonment. The attic door was locked only on evenings of consequence, which was to say often. Mrs. Whitmore insisted that rumors of Eliza's melancholy had already taken root, better to allow them to wither than risk exposure. Downstairs, guests speculated with delicate cruelty. Some spoke of a nervous ailment, others of a romantic indiscretion. Mrs. Whitmore corrected none of it. She merely lowered her lashes and sighed, inviting imagination to do the work she had begun. Eliza pressed her ear to the floorboards and heard her own name carried like a trivial melody through the dance. Laughter followed it. Shame rose in her throat, hot and metallic, yet she swallowed it as one might swallow medicine. On a small writing desk rescued from a nursery, she unfolded a sheet of cream paper and dipped her pen. Ink answered her steadier than any human voice. She wrote not to be rescued but to remain real. In the quiet she described the scent of rain and the ache of being misnamed. She described a longing not for rank but for recognition. "If I must be unseen," she concluded, "let heaven at least bear witness that I once had a heart brave enough to love." She folded the letter with a tenderness usually reserved for living things and placed it in the wooden chest beneath her trunk, where others slept like captive birds. The house trembled with applause below. A toast was being offered. Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose, honeyed and authoritative, praising loyalty, propriety, the careful stewardship of family honor. Eliza felt the words as a pressure against her ribs. Family honor had become a currency she was forbidden to touch. The evening ripened. Carriages arrived in a procession of lacquered silhouettes, and at last a murmur shifted the atmosphere as decisively as a change in weather. His Grace, the Duke of Ravensshire, had crossed the threshold. Even in the attic Eliza sensed the rearrangement of air that followed him. The Duke was spoken of in tones both admiring and wary, a widower young enough to be envied, reserved enough to be feared, possessed of estates that breathed history and a gaze that seemed to weigh a soul before greeting it. Mrs. Whitmore would greet him with calculated warmth. Her daughters would curtsy with disciplined hope. Below, Alexander Ravensshire accepted the hostess's welcome with a bow precise as a blade. He endured the compliments, the fluttering fans, the orchestral swell. Yet the spectacle wearied him. He had learned that ballrooms could disguise vacancy as brilliance. Seeking reprieve, he excused himself to the library, where firelight gathered in contemplative pools upon the carpet. He preferred rooms that allowed silence to speak. It was there, beside the hearth, that a single page lay displaced from any obvious volume. He bent to retrieve it, intending to return it to a footman, but the first line arrested him with a candor that refused to be ornamental. He read of rain as witness, of dignity pressed thin yet unbroken. He read the closing sentence and felt something within him answer it, not pity which he distrusted but recognition. The handwriting was careful without vanity, the pain it contained did not beg to be admired. Upstairs, Eliza moved to extinguish her candle. The wick sputtered, casting a brief rebellion of light against the rafters. In that moment she imagined, absurdly, that someone below had paused, listening. The attic seemed to hold its breath with her. Then the flame steadied, and she set the snuffer aside, unaware that in the library a duke stood very still, the paper warming in his hand as though it possessed a pulse. Alexander looked toward the ceiling, where music thudded faintly like a distant heart. The house was a theater of certainties, yet this letter introduced a doubt he could not dismiss. If Cruelty had contrived to hide a voice of such clarity, then Cruelty had miscalculated. He folded the page once, carefully, and slipped it into his coat. Above him, the unseen author leaned against the locked door, listening to the echo of her own solitude. Below, a man accustomed to command found himself commanded by a sentence. And somewhere between the attic's shadow and the library's glow, a conflict shifted from rumor to intention, as though the rain itself had decided to look upward. Morning entered Grosvenor Square with a fragile brightness, as though uncertain whether the previous evening's splendor deserved repetition. The Whitmore townhouse bore the fatigue of celebration. Wilting garlands exhaled a tired sweetness, and extinguished candles stood like soldiers relieved from duty. Yet within its polished walls, calculation had already resumed its vigil. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore reviewed the guest list at her escritoire, her gloved finger pausing over a single name with proprietary satisfaction. His Grace, the Duke of Ravensshire. His presence had elevated the ball beyond ambition into triumph. His attention, if properly directed, might yet secure permanence. Above her, Eliza woke with the ache of interrupted dreams and the dull certainty of confinement. The key had remained in the lock throughout the night. The message was unmistakable. She rose from her narrow bed and approached the attic window, where the city revealed itself in softened grays. Carriages rolled past with indifferent purpose. Somewhere in those streets lived the man who had read her words, though she knew nothing of it, and the thought would have seemed a fantasy born of hunger. Still, she felt an unaccountable shift in the air, as if her solitude had been overheard. In the library below, Alexander Ravensshire stood alone before the dying embers of the Whitmore hearth. He had returned under the pretext of retrieving a glove, though he carried no intention of searching for it. The letter rested within his coat, its presence both intrusion and invitation. He had read it thrice since dawn, each time discovering a steadiness that rebuked the frivolity he had endured the night before. The voice was not hysterical as gossip had implied, it was lucid, restrained, and wounded with dignity. If the author were indeed the hidden daughter, then society had been complicit in an injustice disguised as propriety. Mrs. Whitmore received him with a gracious astonishment practiced to perfection. "Your Grace honors us twice in as many days," she said, inclining her head with measured humility. "I fear we exhausted our charms last evening." "I seldom mistake exhaustion for emptiness," he replied evenly. "I have come to return something misplaced." Her smile thinned, though it did not falter. "How unfortunate that we misplace so much." He regarded her with a composure that unsettled precisely because it refused aggression. "On the contrary, madam. Some things are hidden with great care." The exchange lingered like the echo of a bell. A servant hovered uncertainly near the staircase, and Alexander noted the upward angle of the man's glance. Without comment, he withdrew a white camellia from the vase beside the mantel, an unassuming bloom, yet flawless in its symmetry. "If you would be so kind," he said to the servant, "ensure this reaches the proper recipient. It belongs where light is scarce." Mrs. Whitmore's fan paused mid-arc. "I cannot imagine to whom your Grace refers." "Then allow imagination to assist you," he answered softly. The flower ascended in cautious hands. Eliza heard the hesitant knock and opened the attic door only as far as the chain permitted. The servant's eyes avoided hers as he extended the camellia and a folded card bearing a single line. "Truth has a way of being discovered." The handwriting was masculine, deliberate, and devoid of flourish. Her pulse quickened not from romance but from alarm. Discovery in her world threatened ruin. She closed the door and pressed the blossom to her lips as though testing its reality. No signature accompanied the message, yet the ink carried authority. She recalled the Duke's name spoken below like a currency of reverence. Could he be capable of such audacity? And if so, what did he seek? Charity, amusement, or justice? The camellia's whiteness felt less like purity than like challenge. Downstairs, Mrs. Whitmore dismissed the Duke with civility sharpened to a blade. Once alone, she summoned the maid who attended the attic. "My stepdaughter is prone to fancies," she warned in a tone sweetened by threat. "Should any correspondence reach her without my inspection, you will answer for it." Alexander departed the townhouse with measured strides, yet his restraint concealed a resolve newly awakened. He had observed the tension beneath Mrs. Whitmore's composure, the guarded staircase, the servant's reluctance. Cruelty often advertised itself through excess control. If the girl were as fragile as rumor insisted, she would not write with such coherence. If she were dangerous, it was only to the lies that confined her. That afternoon a second note arrived, this time slipped beneath the attic door with deliberate quiet. Eliza discovered it as one might discover a heartbeat where silence had long reigned. "I have read your words," it began. "They are neither madness nor impropriety. They are courage. If you wish them to remain unheard, I shall respect your silence. If you wish them defended, I am at your service." Her breath faltered. No man had ever addressed her as equal participant in her own fate. Yet fear coiled around hope with equal vigor. To accept his intervention might invite scandal beyond repair. To refuse it would confirm her erasure. Evening approached, and with it another gathering below. Smaller, more intimate, designed to cultivate influence. Mrs. Whitmore's daughters rehearsed their smiles before mirrored glass. Eliza, unseen, composed her reply upon a scrap torn from the margin of an old ledger. "I do not require rescue," she wrote, though her hand trembled. "Only acknowledgement that I exist." She hesitated before sliding the note through the narrow gap at the stair where the servant waited, bribed not with coin but with kindness. The paper descended toward the library like a quiet rebellion. Alexander received it without visible reaction, yet his eyes darkened with recognition. She did not beg, she asserted. The distinction transformed curiosity into respect. When Mrs. Whitmore entered the room moments later, prepared to entertain him with strategic charm, she found him standing at the base of the staircase, gaze lifted. "Your Grace," she began carefully, "may I offer refreshment?" "You may offer transparency," he replied. A hush rippled through the corridor. Guests nearby sensed a tremor in decorum. Mrs. Whitmore's composure tightened. "I trust you do not question my household." "I question only injustice," he said. Above them, Eliza heard the cadence of his voice carrying through the wood like a promise tempered by steel. The house seemed suspended between exposure and denial. For the first time since her confinement began, she felt not hidden but awaited. And below, before an audience trained to savor scandal, the Duke placed his gloved hand upon the banister and spoke with deliberate clarity. "If Miss Whitmore is to remain unseen, it shall not be by my consent." Thunder gathered over London with the solemnity of a verdict, and rain lashed Grosvenor Square as though the heavens themselves had tired of restraint. Within the Whitmore townhouse, candles guttered against draughts that slipped beneath doors and stirred curtains like anxious breath. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore had dismissed her guests early, citing the storm with a gracious regret that concealed a tightening dread. The Duke's declaration at the staircase had not been forgotten, it had merely retreated into strategy. She paced the drawing room with measured steps, calculating which version of truth might best preserve her authority. Above, Eliza stood beside the attic window, watching lightning fracture the sky into brief revelations. The words spoken below, "If Miss Whitmore is to remain unseen, it shall not be by my consent," echoed within her like a bell that refused to fade. Hope frightened her more than isolation had. Hope implied risk, and risk had been the instrument of her undoing since her father's death. Yet she could not deny the warmth that accompanied the memory of the Duke's voice, steady and unembarrassed by confrontation. She pressed her palm to the cool glass as if testing whether the world beyond might truly admit her. A decisive knock reverberated through the house, distinct even above the storm. Servants exchanged wary glances before admitting Alexander Ravenshire, rain darkening his coat and lending his presence the severity of a portrait come to life. He removed his gloves slowly, each gesture deliberate, as though patience were a weapon sharpened by silence. "I must speak with Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone neither pleading nor apologetic. "Privately." Mrs. Whitmore's smile curved like a ribbon drawn too tight. "My stepdaughter is indisposed, Your Grace. The weather unsettles her." "The weather unsettles many," he replied evenly. "Confinement unsettles more." Lightning illuminated the corridor between them, exposing the fragile architecture of pretense. For a moment, neither yielded. Then Alexander reached into his coat and withdrew Eliza's letter, its creases softened by rereading. "I have reason to believe she is not indisposed," he said quietly. "Merely unheard." Mrs. Whitmore's composure flickered, a hairline fracture beneath porcelain. You presume much. I presume only what is written with courage, he answered. Without awaiting permission he ascended the staircase. Each step carried the weight of scandal, yet he bore it as one accustomed to consequence. The attic door stood at the corridor's end like a final test of resolve. He knocked once, not loudly but with unmistakable intent. Eliza's breath caught. She had imagined many futures, yet none so immediate. When she opened the door, the chain still fastened, she beheld not a rescuer framed in triumph but a man rain-damp and solemn, eyes searching without intrusion. For a heartbeat they regarded one another in silence, two strangers bound by ink and indignation. Miss Whitmore, he said, inclining his head with the courtesy owed a lady, not a prisoner. Your Grace, she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her pulse. He glanced at the chain. May I? The question, simple as it was, altered the axis of her confinement. No one had asked permission in that corridor before. She lifted the latch. The door opened fully, and the storm's rumble softened into distant accompaniment. The attic seemed smaller with him inside, its slanted ceiling lowering the distance between them. Firelight from a hastily lit candle gilded the dust motes that drifted like hesitant stars. He surveyed the room not with pity but with attention, noting the careful order of her few possessions, the stack of letters bound with ribbon, the trunk that served as seat and sanctuary. You have been wronged, he said at last, not as accusation but as recognition. I have been managed, she corrected gently. Wrong suggests outrage. Management suggests benevolence. His gaze sharpened. Do you believe the distinction absolves it? She met his eyes fully then, and he perceived the resilience rumor had denied her. I believe outrage is costly, she said. Benevolence costs nothing. Thunder answered her words. He stepped closer, though not enough to trespass upon her dignity. Your letters speak of longing, yet not of surrender. That is not the voice of fragility. My letters were never meant to be read. Yet they were meant to be true. The candle flame steadied between them. In its glow, vulnerability displaced formality. He removed the folded pages from his coat and offered them back. I have no claim upon your confidences, he said. I sought only to ensure they were not silenced. She accepted the papers with hands that brushed his briefly, the contact neither accidental nor indulgent. A current passed between them, less heat than clarity. For the first time since her father's death, she felt seen without being scrutinized. Why does it matter to you? She asked quietly. He did not answer at once. The storm filled the pause with restless percussion. Because I once mistook compliance for virtue, he said finally. It cost me more than reputation. The admission lingered, incomplete yet sufficient. She sensed the shadow of a history he guarded as carefully as she guarded her letters. In that shared restraint, intimacy took root. Below, a door closed sharply. Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried upward, edged with alarm. The household was no longer suspended in polite denial. It trembled on the brink of exposure. Alexander extended his hand, not to command but to invite. You may remain here, he said. Or you may descend with me and allow truth to stand beside you. I will not compel either choice. Eliza looked from his hand to the attic's narrow window, where lightning revealed the city in fleeting brilliance. Confinement had taught her caution, dignity now urged decision. She placed her fingers within his grasp, not seeking rescue but accepting witness. They descended together, the staircase transforming from barrier to bridge. At its base stood Mrs. Whitmore, pale beneath candlelight, determination battling disbelief. Guests who had lingered for shelter turned their attention toward the unfolding tableau. Your Grace, Mrs. Whitmore began, voice trembling with orchestrated injury, this display is unnecessary. On the contrary, he replied, releasing Eliza's hand only when she stood beside him of her own accord. It is overdue. Eliza felt the room's scrutiny settle upon her like a mantle both heavy and clarifying. Shame no longer dictated her posture, it merely tested it. She lifted her chin, aware that every whisper in the corridor would carry beyond these walls. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes hardened. You forget yourself, child. I remember myself, Eliza answered, her tone quiet yet unyielding. The storm subsided as if exhausted by conflict, leaving the house in charged stillness. Alexander regarded Mrs. Whitmore with a composure that brooked no evasion. If Miss Whitmore leaves this house, he said, each word deliberate, it shall be under my protection. Gasps fluttered like startled birds. Eliza felt the declaration not as possession but as defiance directed toward injustice. Yet protection implied departure, and departure implied irrevocable change. Mrs. Whitmore's smile fractured at last. "And what would society conclude, Your Grace?" He did not look away from Eliza as he answered, "That society has underestimated her." In the silence that followed, Eliza understood that the attic door had opened in more ways than one. The choice before her was no longer whether to endure invisibility, but whether to step into a light that would demand equal courage. And as the final echo of thunder faded beyond the square, she sensed that the next word spoken, hers or his, by the following evening, London had devoured the story whole and was already asking for more. Whispers slipped through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs with the efficiency of seasoned couriers. A duke had ascended a staircase not meant for him. A hidden daughter had descended beside him. Mrs. Whitmore's carefully polished reputation now bore the faintest crack, and society, ever hungry for fracture, pressed close to examine it. Yet no formal accusation had been made, no engagement declared. The uncertainty itself became spectacle. Eliza felt the weight of that spectacle in every glance cast her way. For the first time since her father's death, she occupied a chamber below stairs, no longer confined to the attic yet not entirely restored. Mrs. Whitmore had unlocked the upper door with a composure so rigid it seemed carved from marble, announcing that her stepdaughter would, of course, rejoin the household properly. The concession was strategic, not repentant. Control had not been relinquished, it had merely adapted. "You will conduct yourself with impeccable restraint," Mrs. Whitmore instructed that morning, adjusting Eliza's sleeve with fingers that tightened rather than smoothed. "Gratitude is a more becoming adornment than defiance." Eliza met her gaze steadily. "I shall conduct myself with truth." The answer was quiet, yet it unsettled more than rebellion might have done. Mrs. Whitmore withdrew her hands as though contact itself had become unpredictable. That night, an invitation arrived from the Duke of Ravensshire, written in a script as disciplined as his demeanor. A private musicale at his townhouse in Mayfair, limited in number, impeccable in selection. Attendance would not be optional without insult. Mrs. Whitmore understood the implication immediately. Alexander intended not secrecy but acknowledgement. Eliza stood before the mirror as twilight gathered, her reflection unfamiliar in a gown retrieved from storage, a simple ivory silk her father had once admired. It lacked the aggressive ornament favored by her stepsisters. Its elegance relied upon line rather than spectacle. She fastened a modest pearl at her throat, resisting the urge to conceal herself further. If she were to enter society again, it would not be disguised. Alexander awaited his guests beneath chandeliers that refracted light into deliberate brilliance. His townhouse exuded cultivated restraint, dark paneling, portraits of ancestors whose eyes suggested both judgment and endurance. He had orchestrated the evening with precision, inviting those whose influence could either protect or destroy. If scandal must unfold, he would shape its stage. When Eliza entered on Mrs. Whitmore's arm, conversation thinned to a brittle hush. Alexander crossed the room without haste, each step a declaration more potent than announcement. He bowed first to Mrs. Whitmore, honoring protocol, then turned to Eliza with a gravity that excluded all others. "Miss Whitmore," he said, extending his hand, "you honor my house." "Your Grace," she replied, placing her gloved fingers within his, "you test it." A flicker of approval touched his expression. "Then let it prove worthy." Music began, strings unfolding a waltz measured and restrained. Alexander guided her to the floor, not claiming but inviting, his hand firm at her waist yet attentive to the slightest hesitation. Around them, society watched with sharpened curiosity. Every turn became evidence, every pause speculation. "You understand the consequence of this evening," she murmured as they revolved beneath the chandelier's glow. "I do," he answered. "Do you?" "I understand that reputation once fractured seldom mends. And dignity once denied seldom survives." She searched his face for vanity and found none. "Why risk yours for mine?" "Because I have already risked mine for less," he said quietly. "I will not repeat the error." The admission threaded through her like warmth. He did not speak as savior but as penitent for former silence. Their steps aligned, the dance transforming from performance into conversation conducted through movement. Whispers rippled outward, yet neither flinched. Across the room, Mrs. Whitmore observed with a composure strained thin as glass. She had intended reintegration on her terms, not his. When the music concluded, she advanced with strategic urgency. "Your Grace," she began, voice pitched to carry just far enough, "my stepdaughter is unaccustomed to such attention. One fears it may overwhelm her delicate constitution." Alexander's gaze cooled. Miss Whitmore appears remarkably composed. Eliza met the surrounding stares without lowering her eyes. I assure you, madam, my constitution improves an honest air. A ripple of restrained laughter stirred the edges of the assembly. Mrs. Whitmore's fan snapped open, a small but telling fracture. Alexander seized the moment with calculated clarity. There have been suggestions, he said, addressing the room as much as the hostess, that Miss Whitmore's absence from society derived from instability. Having conversed with her extensively, I find her intellect neither fragile nor unseemly. Silence expanded, dense and anticipatory. Mrs. Whitmore's daughters shifted uneasily, their prospects entangled in the unfolding narrative. Your Grace, Mrs. Whitmore replied, each word polished to defensive sheen, family matters are seldom suited to public dissection. Then let them not be distorted publicly, he returned. Eliza felt the axis of power tilt subtly. He was not attacking, he was clarifying. The distinction altered the room's allegiance. Curiosity began to edge toward sympathy. A quartet commenced another piece, softer, almost reverent. Alexander turned back to Eliza. May I? He asked, offering his hand once more, this time not for dance but for declaration. She hesitated only long enough to recognize that refusal would restore the attic's shadow. Placing her hand in his, she allowed him to guide her toward the center of the room where attention converged inevitably. There are those, he said, voice measured yet resonant, who inherit titles by accident of birth. There are others who inherit courage through trial. I know which I esteem. The words did not shout, they settled like irrevocable truth. Eliza felt her pulse steady rather than race. For years she had been defined by absence. Now she was being defined by witness. Mrs. Whitmore's composure faltered visibly. Surely, Your Grace, you do not imply. I imply nothing, he interrupted gently. I state plainly that Miss Whitmore deserves the regard denied her. He released Eliza's hand only to step slightly before her, not eclipsing but aligning. The gesture, subtle yet unmistakable, positioned her not behind protection but beside it. Miss Whitmore, he continued, turning to her fully while the room held its breath, will you permit me the honor of defending your name wherever it is questioned? The question hovered, vast in implication yet devoid of coercion. It was not a proposal of marriage, yet neither was it mere courtesy. It was an invitation to stand publicly allied. Eliza felt every eye upon her, felt also the memory of the attic's slanted ceiling pressing against her former silence. She could retreat into caution, preserving what little equilibrium remained. Or she could accept that dignity sometimes required audacity. She lifted her chin, voice clear despite the tremor in the air. I will permit no defense that treats me as incapable of my own, she said. But I will not refuse partnership. A murmur swept through the gathering, shock, admiration, recalibration. Alexander's expression softened into something dangerously close to admiration. Then stand beside me, he replied, not as charity but as equal. Mrs. Whitmore's fan slipped from her grasp, striking the polished floor with a sound sharper than thunder. In that small fracture, years of manipulation quivered on the brink of exposure. And as the music swelled uncertainly around them, Eliza understood that the next movement in this dance would not belong to gossip or guardianship, but to a choice that could either cement scandal, or transform it into destiny. Mourning did not soften the consequences of the previous night, it sharpened them. London awoke ravenous, and by noon the tale had matured from whisper to judgment. Some called the Duke gallant, others reckless. Some called Eliza fortunate, others cunning. Reputation, that most fragile currency of the age, fluttered in uncertain exchange. Yet within the Raven's higher townhouse, the atmosphere was not fevered but resolute. Alexander had expected resistance. What he had not anticipated was the clarity with which Eliza now occupied his thoughts, not as obligation but as conviction. She stood at the tall window of a modest guest chamber he had insisted she accept temporarily, chaperoned by an elderly cousin of impeccable standing to silence impropriety. The city stretched beyond the glass in ordered symmetry, its chimneys exhaling the breath of industry and opinion alike. For the first time Eliza was not hidden. Neither was she secure. She understood the delicacy of her position. A young woman under a duke's protection invited admiration and suspicion in equal measure. Yet beneath the scrutiny she felt something steadier than fear. She felt choice. Alexander entered without ceremony, though not without courtesy. You have seen the papers, he said, placing a folded broadsheet upon the table between them. I have, she replied calmly. They describe me as either victim or opportunist. I recognize neither portrait. Nor do I, he answered. He studied her closely, not for weakness but for hesitation. It would have been easier had she leaned upon him unquestioningly. Instead, she met his gaze with the quiet authority that had first compelled him. She would not be saved as an ornament, she would stand as participant. My advisors urge caution, he admitted. They suggest distance until gossip exhausts itself. And will it? She asked. No. Gossip seldom dies of neglect. It dies of truth. Silence settled, not heavy but deliberate. Eliza moved toward the table and placed her father's signet ring upon its surface, a relic she had preserved even in the attic's dust. My father believed reputation was a garden, she said. It must be tended openly, not hidden beneath boards. If we retreat, we confirm their narrative. Alexander felt admiration sharpen into respect. Then you propose confrontation. I propose clarity. He inclined his head slightly, conceding both strategy and equality. There is a charity assembly this evening at St. Bartholomew's Hall. The attendance will be comprehensive. She understood at once. The hall would gather peers, patrons, and critics alike. To appear together, not as scandal but as intention, would risk everything. To abstain would forfeit the momentum she had only just claimed. I will attend, she said. He did not smile broadly, he did not need to. As my guest, he replied, then corrected himself with subtle emphasis, as my equal. Across the city, Mrs. Agnes Whitmore prepared her own counterstroke. She had not cultivated influence for decades only to see it undone by youthful defiance. Invitations were dispatched discreetly, alliances quietly reaffirmed. By evening she intended to reassert narrative control. If Eliza insisted upon stepping into society, then society would be reminded of who shaped its memory. St. Bartholomew's Hall glittered beneath 100 gas lamps, their light refracting through crystal prisms suspended like captured stars. The air carried the mingled sense of polished wood and expectation. Conversations swelled and receded like orchestral tuning, each voice measuring the room's temperature. When Alexander entered with Eliza upon his arm, a hush rippled outward, not hostile but electric. She wore ivory once more, though tonight the silk seemed less fragile, as though courage had altered its weave. No ostentation distracted from her composure. She did not cling to Alexander, she walked beside him. That distinction alone unsettled assumptions. Mrs. Whitmore stood near the dais, resplendent in deep amethyst, her expression a masterwork of injured dignity. As Eliza approached, their eyes met, past grievance, past strategy into recognition of a contest no longer concealed. My dear child, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice pitched to Carrie, I had feared the excitement of recent events would overwhelm you. Eliza inclined her head, neither submissive nor insolent. Excitement clarifies more than it overwhelms, madam. A murmur stirred. Alexander did not intervene. This was her ground. Mrs. Whitmore gestured delicately toward the surrounding assembly. Society values discretion. A young woman's future depends upon it. And truth sustains it, Eliza replied. Before further exchange could escalate, the chairman of the charity called for attention. Speeches commenced, earnest and measured, yet beneath them coursed a secondary performance. Eyes drifted toward the trio whose private conflict had become public entertainment. At last, Alexander rose when invited to contribute remarks on behalf of his family's patronage. He ascended the dais with unhurried confidence, the hall quieting in anticipation. Esteemed colleagues, he began, voice resonant without force, we gather to support the vulnerable among us. It would be a peculiar charity that recognized need only when it proved convenient. A subtle shift in posture rippled through the crowd. There are those, he continued, whose voices have been dismissed not for lack of merit, but for surplus of discomfort. It is simpler to name courage as instability than to confront injustice. Mrs. Whitmore's fan stilled. I speak not in abstraction, he said, turning deliberately toward Eliza. Miss Whitmore has been the subject of speculation. I will not permit speculation to masquerade as fact. A breathless pause followed. She possesses intellect, integrity, and fortitude beyond reproach. Any insinuation to the contrary reflects not upon her character, but upon the cruelty of rumor. The words did not thunder, they anchored. Eliza felt the hall's scrutiny transform from suspicion to appraisal. She stepped forward unbidden, ascending the dais to stand beside him. If I may, she said, her voice clear though unamplified by title, I have been silent too long to allow others to define my narrative. My absence from society was not illness. It was confinement. The admission struck with greater force than accusation. Gasps, restrained yet audible, fluttered across the assembly. "I do not recount this to invite pity," she continued, meeting Mrs. Whitmore's gaze without malice. "I recount it because dignity demands acknowledgement. I was hidden to preserve comfort, not truth." Mrs. Whitmore rose abruptly. "This is an outrageous distortion." Eliza faced her fully. "Then let us examine it plainly. Was I not locked away during gatherings? Were rumors of my instability not encouraged?" Silence answered more eloquently than denial. Servants who had once averted their eyes now watched openly. Society's allegiance shifted not through spectacle, but through the steady unveiling of fact. Alexander spoke again, not louder but firmer. "Protection that imprisons is not protection. It is control." Mrs. Whitmore's composure fractured, her voice sharpening. "You would destroy a family standing over childish grievance?" Eliza descended the dais and approached her stepmother, not aggressively but resolutely. "No, madam," she said. "I would restore it through honesty." The simplicity of the declaration disarmed more effectively than outrage could have done. Years of manipulation, once unspoken, now lay exposed beneath the hall's relentless light. Mrs. Whitmore faltered, her alliances wavering as acquaintances subtly distanced themselves. Influence thrives upon perception. Perception had shifted. Alexander extended his hand to Eliza before the entire assembly, not as rescuer but as partner. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice carrying with quiet gravity, "I will not ask you to accept my protection. I ask instead whether you will accept my future." The hall seemed to inhale collectively. "This is not charity," he continued. "It is choice. I have admired your courage in shadow and in light. I would be honored to stand beside you not as savior but as husband, should you find me worthy." The proposal, stripped of ornament, resonated with sincerity. Eliza felt the culmination of every humiliation, every whispered slight, every quiet act of endurance converge upon this instant. To accept would bind her fate irrevocably to his. To refuse would affirm independence at the cost of alliance. She searched his face for presumption and found humility instead. He did not assume consent, he awaited it. "I will not exchange one confinement for another," she said, her voice unwavering. "You shall exchange nothing," he replied. "You shall choose." The hall waited, suspended between scandal and sanctification. Eliza turned slowly, surveying the assembly that had once dismissed her as rumor. She felt no desire for revenge, only resolution. Then she placed her hand in Alexander's. "I choose partnership," she said. The declaration ignited applause, hesitant at first, then swelling with conviction. Mrs. Whitmore stood isolated amid the sound, her authority diminished not by cruelty but by exposure. As the hall erupted into congratulatory murmurs, Alexander drew Eliza close, not possessively but protectively, reverently. The transformation was complete. The girl hidden in the attic now stood at the center of society's gaze, not as spectacle but as sovereign of her own narrative. Yet even amid triumph, Eliza sensed the magnitude of what had shifted. Love had not rescued her, truth had. Love had merely recognized it. Outside, the night air felt startlingly clear as they stepped from the hall together. Gas lamps flickered along the street like witnesses reluctant to blink. Alexander paused before the waiting carriage. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she answered with honesty. "So am I." The admission steadied rather than unsettled her. Fear shared was no longer tyranny. As the carriage door closed and wheels began to turn, London watched, not with derision now, but with fascination transformed into respect. The attic window in Grosvenor Square would never again confine its former occupant. The key had been surrendered not in secrecy but in declaration. And as the carriage disappeared into the luminous dark, the final remnants of whispered cruelty dissolved beneath the undeniable force of a woman who had chosen to step into her own destiny, and a man who had dared to meet her there.